You know exactly what you want from life. Yet every time you lunge toward it, some unseen hand drags you back. Tonight we expose that invisible gala, trauma lodged in your very flesh, and draft the battle plan to break you free. Power seldom announces itself. It settles into tissue, tendon, and the subtle axis of breath like a monarch who has already conquered the realm and no longer needs to raise a flag. Childhood shocks, ancestral grief, humiliations endured in the cramped corridors of adolescence. Each arrives as a lone emissary and departs, leaving behind a garrison. The body, once a neutral province devoted to sensation and movement, becomes a fortified state whose battlements are clenched jaws, hunched shoulders, hips that refuse to swing wide. Ask a soldier why he stands guard on a wall 5 centuries after the threat has passed, and he will answer only with ritual. So too with the diaphragm that refuses to descend it, no longer remembers the original siege, only the order never to lower the drawbridge. In this way trauma graduates from mere memory to constitution, codified in connective tissue and enforced without debate. The result is a citizen who mistakes guarded muscles for ordinary posture and who grows fluent in self-limitation, speaking softly, stepping lightly, negotiating every desire with an internal customs officer who levies a silent tax upon every thrill, ambition, or intimacy that seeks passage across the border of the skin. Once this sovereign is installed, it controls not only how the body holds itself, but how the mind perceives possibility. Nerve signals dispatched from tight fascia tell the cortex that danger is ambient, that expansion is reckless, that the horizon is not an invitation but a trap. Thus a man, whose chest collapsed to shield against an unpredictable father, may later interpret the forward thrust of opportunity as a blow aimed at the heart. A woman whose pelvic floor cinched in the aftermath of betrayal may read sexual curiosity as a summons to war. The conscious mind drafts grand declarations, new business ventures, daring climbs, declarations of love. But each edict must travel through a landscape patrolled by muscular magistrates who scratch out whatever lines contradict the old order. No dream leaves the palace unredacted. The body, in this regime, is not an instrument of aspiration but a censor. Strategy demands reconnaissance. To depose an invisible sovereign, you must first map its territories. Begin before dawn when the world is quiet and the nervous system has not yet recruited allies from caffeine and screen glare. Sit upright, close the eyes, and breathe as though filling a reservoir beneath the navel. Where does the breath halt? That plateau marks the first fortress. Scan upward. Notice how the shoulders, despite explicit permission to drop, cling to their ridgeline like archers unwilling to abandon high ground. Observe the tongue pressed into the roof of the mouth, as if sealing a vault where unspoken sentences still rattle their chains. Each discovery is a cartographic coordinate, a red X on the royal map indicating where the coup must begin. Record these coordinates in writing. Ink is an ally that will not let you forget. Interrogation follows mapping. Pressure applied by palm, lacrosse ball, or therapist's skilled thumb serves as both question and torch. Under sustained contact, the tissue will yield stories in the dialect of sensation. A sharp burn in the glute, whispering of the sprint aborted by ridicule. A dull ache along the spine admitting to nights spent sleeping light, because footsteps in the hallway forecast chaos. Listen without rushing to fix. The sovereign survives because subjects hurry to numb the messengers. They apply ice, scroll screens, or recite affirmations that gloss over the body's inconvenient testimony. Patience starves the tyrant of secrecy. Keep pressing until the tension quivers, until heat blossoms, until a sigh escapes unplanned. Evidence that the guard at that post has been disarmed. Liberation is not secured by insight alone. Power vacuums invite counter, revolution, and the nervous system rallies old generals whenever novelty feels too vast. Therefore, drills must replace revelations. Slow cat crawls across the floor teach wrists and hips to bear weight they once delegated to adrenaline. Sustained eye contact during conversation retrains facial muscles to host courage rather than camouflage. Deliberate exhalations longer than the inhale coax the vagus nerve into broadcasting peace. Repetition here is both propaganda and parade, a daily procession through liberated streets convincing each cell that the new administration holds. Yet vigilance remains the tax of freedom. Weather shifts, deadlines loom, a familiar voice resurfaces, and the body reflexively tightens its perimeter. Recognize this not as failure, but as a flare signaling where surveillance must thicken. Adjust the breath, stretch the hamstrings, retrieve the earlier map, and note any border now contested. Sovereignty, once seized, must be patrolled until the memory of the old regime fades from sinew and scar alike, until impulse and intention walk arm in arm without the covert escort of fear, until the sovereign you awaken with each morning rise is none other than the will you consciously choose to enthrone, without compromise or concession to phantoms that no longer command the field. To the undiscerning, pain appears as mere catastrophe, an involuntary descent into darkness, an eruption of chaos that mocks order and dissolves certainty. Yet those who study the anatomy of mastery see torment as a raw ore, glimmering with potential energy that waits to be smelted into something rarer than comfort, unassailable power. Consider the furnace of a medieval forge. Bellows stoke air into roaring flame, slag drips away, and the blacksmith's hammer coaxes brittle fragments into an instrument of dominion. So too can anguish be incinerated, purified, and struck into a weapon that serves its wielder, provided the operator accepts the heat instead of recoiling. The first stage of this alchemy is honest inventory. You trace the outline of every wound, the way a metallurgist inspects veins of iron hidden in dull rock. Where did the betrayal cleave your sense of safety? Where does shame still smolder, casting fumes that choke ambition? Each recollection, though it stings like hot metal, identifies the impurities to be incinerated. Denial merely buries them deeper. Only examination exposes what must burn away. When the ledger of injuries is complete, the body becomes the crucible. Rather than flee into distraction, you bring sensation to a boil through breathwork, cold immersion, or vigorous exertion that drives the heart like a bellows. Elevated pulse and trembling limbs mimic the quake of old panic, yet now you remain sovereign, observing the furnace from within its walls. Heat coerces dormant memories to surface, pigments of terror bleeding into consciousness. The untrained novice mistakes this upwelling for fresh harm and abandons the process. The seasoned alchemist keeps stoking, knowing that molten metal cannot be shaped until boundaries blur and former rigidity liquefies. Sweat is the evidence of walls dissolving. Tears run like molten slag. Numb areas throb to life, announcing that anesthetized nerve endings have rejoined the realm of perception. This is not regression. It is the ore acknowledging its destiny to be transmuted. Next arrives separation. Like dross skimmed from smelted iron, each hiss of exhale carries away fragments of obsolete narrative. The promise you waited to be kept, the apology never spoken, the confrontation you rehearsed but postponed. Exhalations lengthen, spines lengthen, and the ribcage finds new curvature. No longer a cage but an archway. Space appears inside joints that once fused into rigidity. Into this vacancy pours a strange electricity. Vitality unspent, vitality previously shackled to vigilance. Observe how the eyes sharpen, as though the world's edges have been resharpened. Dialogue grows precise, humor turns wry. Where there was once complaint, there is strategy. Where there was once plea, there is command. Pain, stripped of theatrics, reveals itself as concentrated attention waiting to be redirected. Forging follows purification. The nervous system, still hot from ordeal, is pliable. Here disciplined repetition imprints new grooves into synaptic clay. You pair each breath with assertion, a stance wide enough to claim space, a sentence spoken at full volume, a decision executed before doubt rallies. The hammer must strike while the metal glows. Wait too long and it cools into its old, brittle form. Codify rituals that rehearse expansion, martial drills, public speaking, creative risk, until the voltage of former hurt powers the circuits of capability. Failure within these rehearsals is not a setback. It is the hammer's echo, deepening density, eliminating pockets of weakness. What was once trembling becomes tremorless strength. What was once flinch becomes forward lean. The alchemist does not beg for transformation, he coerces it by sheer constancy of strike. Tempering is the final refinement, though no chorus crowns it. Just as steel, once forged, must be cooled with calculated slowness to gain resilience, so the nervous system requires calibrated rest. Sleep taken on a predictable schedule, meals consumed with deliberate chew, silence honored at dawn, all serve to align glial scaffolding and hormonal tides. Without tempering, raw edge chips under first impact. With it, the newly minted instrument survives siege after siege, announcing its perversely elegant origin. Once molten agony, now articulated authority. The memory of pain remains, like carbon folded into katana steel, yet it no longer corrupts structure. It fortifies every line of force, making surrender unthinkable. Rendering fragility obsolete, the architect of victory surveys the landscape before drawing a single sword. Likewise, mastery over trauma demands that you chart every rampart and ambush woven into your own flesh. Your body is a fortress erected by necessity. Walls of tightened fascia, drawbridges of guarded breath, watchtowers of vigilant eyes, and no campaign to reclaim your desires can prosper while these defenses remain unmapped. Begin with reconnaissance conducted in stillness. Sit in a straight, back chair at dawn when the world is disarmed. Close your eyes and breathe in layers as if descending a spiral staircase. Notice where the air meets an iron grate and refuses to travel further. That is a gate long closed against ancient siege. Observe which muscles anticipate threat by gripping before any danger appears, the trapezius twitching like an eager sentry, the pelvic floor clenching as though it alone can bar marauders. Each involuntary contraction is a garrison funded by old fear, consuming resources you now need for conquest. Do not rush this survey. A prince who mistakes rumor for intelligence forfeits his throne. A seeker who mistakes surface tension for the whole story plunges unprepared into war. Trace with fingertip the ridges of your ribs, feeling for asymmetry that betrays where past impact left residue. Palpate the abdomen and count how many fingers you can sink before the tissue stiffens like a city gate bolted at sundown. Track eye movement while recalling a memory of shame. If pupils dart to a corner, that corner is the cellar where embarrassment still chains your boldness. Record each finding in a ledger, the body's atlas of secret roads and closed provinces. So strategy can be drafted with precision rather than hope. Hope is a gambler's virtue, precision belongs to rulers. Awareness, however, is not mere observation, it is the disciplined assembly of knowledge into actionable geometry. Having mapped your internal terrain, calculate the lines of supply. Which daily habits ferry anxiety into the bloodstream? Which voices stir dormant panic? Which hours of the clock coincide with somatic curfew, when muscles shrink and breath turns to shallow tribute? Maybe the phone call from an elder relative tightens your throat, because their tone echoes the critic who once belittled your ambitions. Maybe fluorescent office lights trigger the posture of submission you learned in school corridors. Identifying these subtle catalysts converts vague dread into quantifiable patterns, and what is quantified can be interrupted, rerouted, replaced. Interruption is the next maneuver. When you notice shoulders rising toward the ears during conflict, bleed tension from the neck with a deliberate yawn, not a performative gesture, but a slow unhinging that drags oxygen deep into the belly and signals allied nerves to stand down. Should the heart accelerate at a sudden noise, widen your stance, plant feet as if claiming territory, and exhale through pursed lips, extending the breath until the pulse concedes. Such micro-interventions redraw borders in real time, proving to the autonomic kingdom that a new sovereign governs response. Each successful redirection adds a stone to the bastion of agency, and over weeks these stones assemble into a citadel from which desire can unfurl banners without fear of internal sabotage. Replacement follows interruption. A vacant stronghold invites occupation, so rituals of strength must supplant reflexes of siege. If the jaw once clenched to muffle speech, institute a daily drill of articulation, reading dense prose aloud, savoring every consonant until the mandible associates exertion with eloquence rather than silence. If hips froze in anticipation of threat, learn movements that demand pelvic fluidity, dance, kettlebell swings, controlled squats, until the nervous system equates mobility with competence instead of exposure. In this way, strategic awareness evolves from passive cartography into active reconstruction, each exercise a scaffold supporting the next level of expansion. Finally, codify surveillance. An empire endures by patrolling its borders even in peacetime. Schedule quarterly, state councils, with body workers, mentors, or honest companions who will audit posture, breath, and tone, exposing any province that has drifted back into rebellion. Install daily sentinels such as a 3-minute midday scan, eyes closed, breath measured, inventory taken, to detect creeping tension before it amasses troops. Keep the ledger current, noting not only where tension persists, but where new ease has taken root. For triumph should be tracked with the same rigor as threat. Through such relentless appraisal, awareness ceases to be a momentary spotlight and becomes a governance system, ensuring that no forgotten corridor becomes the breeding ground for the next uprising, and that every corridor already illuminated remains loyal to the throne you are sculpting in real-time. Liberation from somatic tyranny is not won through inspiration or passive realization. It is forged in the fires of confrontation. This confrontation is not theatrical rage or impulsive defiance. It is a systematic, deliberate exposure to the very sensations, memories, and contractions you've spent years avoiding. The trauma that lives in your body is cunning. It knows how to retreat beneath layers of habit, posture, politeness, and numbness. To flush it out, to stand eye to eye with it, demands a discipline that resembles warfare, not of swords and shouts, but of breath, stillness, repetition, and an iron refusal to flinch. Each contraction, each flinch, each area of chronic pain or numbness is a fortress you built when you had no other defense. But what once protected you has now become your prison, and freedom requires siege. The body does not lie. You may speak affirmations, visualize abundance, chant mantras in candle-lit rooms, but if your diaphragm still trembles when you speak your truth, if your shoulders hunch like a soldier anticipating blows, if your pelvis locks at the first hint of intimacy, then it is your body, not your beliefs, that governs your life. Discipline begins with the refusal to accept this split. You must demand unity. You must require that your breath match your voice, that your muscles mirror your mission. This is the first act of confrontation. To walk into the very places in your flesh where power was once abandoned and insist it return. But power does not return to the casual. It returns to those who are willing to earn it by tolerating the heat of what they once ran from. You begin with the smallest possible front lines, a long exhale in a moment of panic, a 2-minute cold shower that mimics the shock of helplessness, not as punishment but as training. A conversation you would normally avoid, delivered with the steadiness of a general issuing a declaration. These are not random acts. They are surgical incursions into the terrain of avoidance. Each time you hold still as the wave of discomfort rises, each time you breathe slower instead of faster, each time you resist the urge to shrink, you are proving to your nervous system that it no longer needs to collapse to survive. This is not mere bravery. It is architectural reprogramming. You are teaching your tissue that fire no longer means ruin. It means purification. What emerges during these confrontations is often uglier than expected. Old rage disguised as stomach tension, shame oozing out of slouched posture, grief stored in the hollow of the chest like smoke trapped in a ruined temple. These revelations do not come gently. They come with convulsions, sobbing, shaking, disorientation. But these are not signs of breaking. They are signs of breaking open. Do not confuse the tremor of transformation for weakness. The trembling is the body unlearning its old religion. The tears are the release of 1,000 prayers whispered in silence and never answered, until now, when your presence itself becomes the answer. Presence is the ultimate confrontation. To remain present with what you once exiled is the most militant act you can commit in the name of your own becoming. Eventually, confrontation evolves into rhythm. What once required extraordinary effort becomes part of your protocol. You learn to spot tension as it rises, and you intercept it with breath before it installs itself. You hear the voice of doubt not as a master, but as a guest whose tricks you've memorized. You enter conflict with a spine straightened not by ego, but by preparation. This rhythm becomes your new nervous system. It no longer belongs to fear. It belongs to the self that chose to stay. And even more critically, it belongs to the self that learned how to stay without armor. Because the goal is not to become invincible. It is to become unafraid of being fully visible, tensionless, and engaged. Even while standing in the same terrain that once made you vanish, each confrontation reclaims an inch of territory once held by the ghosts of panic. Each breath held a second longer than instinct demands is a dagger driven into the heart of flight. Over time, the body learns not only to stop fleeing, but to start hunting. Not for war, but for the edges where growth waits, disguised as discomfort. You begin to chase the very moments that once paralyzed you, not out of masochism, but because you now recognize them as gates. Gates to more movement, more voice, more intimacy, more presence. Gates you now have the tools to pry open, walk through, and never again close behind you in the name of false safety. The body becomes the battlefield, but also the kingdom, and eventually the throne. You begin to carry the memory of the fight not as a burden, but as a standard, visible proof that you did not merely survive, but overthrew the regime within and began to write laws in the language of unshakable presence. Revolutions worth remembering never die with the first generation. They insinuate themselves into laws, architecture, and folklore until even those born centuries later inherit new reflexes they did nothing to earn. When you dismantle the somatic tyranny that once dictated your posture and priorities, the victory reverberates far beyond your personal timeline. You become a living precedent, proof that flesh and destiny are negotiable. And this proof radiates outward, first into the gestures of the people who touch your life, then into the invisible scripts of communities that watch you move, and eventually into the cultural memory that defines what future bodies may dare. A spine that no longer bows at the hint of authority teaches children to stand taller without instruction. A breath that descends unimpeded into the abdomen sets a tone around dinner tables, where anxiety once flavored every conversation like bitter salt. In this way, liberation is contagious. It spreads by mimicry faster than it can be preached, insinuating courage into micro movements nobody notices until an entire lineage wakes one morning and finds it normal to speak frankly, to digest calmly, to sleep unguarded. Yet contagion alone is not legacy. True inheritance requires deliberate codification. After a kingdom is won, the wise ruler drafts charters, erects monuments, and trains successors, ensuring that freedom is not squandered by complacency. In the realm of the body, this codification takes the form of rituals you teach rather than merely display. You invite a friend to breathe with you before negotiations, normalizing physiological preparation rather than caffeine-fueled jitters. You establish family rites, maybe a nightly stretch circle where laughter loosens hips and grudges evaporate before dreams begin, so that no quarrel petrifies into silent decades of frozen shoulders. You document techniques in journals, videos, workshops, refusing to let them dissolve into the ether of private enlightenment. Every record is a stone tablet buried into future soil, waiting for distant hands to unearth, and rid legacy also thrives on architecture, the deliberate design of spaces that reward openness and penalize contraction. A home arranged so that sunlight greets the face in the earliest hour coaxes the optic nerve into rhythms that immunize against despair. Desks positioned to encourage open, chest posture makes slouching an inconvenient aberration rather than habitual collapse. Even the public square can be shaped by liberated bodies. A leader who addresses the crowd with grounded feet and relaxed jaw teaches, by sheer presence, that authority need not echo trauma. Eventually, city planners mirror what citizens embody, and spaces evolve that honor breathing room over crowd control. But perhaps the deepest imprint of liberation appears in crisis, when unexpected calamity tests the nervous system's default settings. Where once the ancestral code would have triggered lockdown, clenched fists, narrowed focus, the frantic rush to assign blame, now a new operating manual engages. Breath expands first, scanning for opportunity amid rubble. Shoulders settle, freeing cognitive bandwidth for strategy. The voice stays modulated, allowing dialogue where there used to be decree. Onlookers watch this poise under pressure and recalibrate their own thresholds for panic. They borrow the steadiness as if it were common currency. They circulate it, they spend it on decisions that avert further chaos. Thus each catastrophe becomes not a relapse into rigidity, but an arena where the inheritance of calm demonstrates its yield. Of course, inheritance is fragile if unguarded. Complacency creeps in with prosperity, memory of former shackles fades, new generations born into ease. Risk mistaking resilience for birthright rather than cultivated resource. The custodian of legacy must therefore weave reminders into culture the way a blacksmith tempers steel. Controlled cooling punctuated by renewed heat. Periodic challenges are sought intentionally, fasting retreats, endurance treks, seasons of creative risk that cook complacency out of the lineage and infuse it with tensile strength. These trials are not punitive. They are reenactments of the original liberation, mythic tableaux where muscle and mind rehearse the drama of choosing expansion over constriction. Through such rites, the liberated body becomes both archive and oracle, preserving the story of its emancipation while forecasting new dimensions of possibility. In the end, a legacy of liberation is measured not by statues or accolades, but by the subtle metrics of collective ease. Conversations that flow without subtextual tremor, migrations pursued from curiosity rather than desperation, ambitions launched without the ballast of inherited dread, and the architecture of your lineage realigned around courage, echoing through gestures, decisions, and quiet midnight breaths. Victory without vigilance is a banquet left unattended. Sooner or later, opportunistic hands will strip the table bare. In the theater of the body, emancipation from trauma's occupation is only the opening act, while maintenance is the lifelong performance. Freed muscles will drift back toward servitude the instant attention wavers, like fields reverting to wilderness when farmers abandon the plow. Guarding the realm, therefore, becomes a discipline of perpetual court watch, a choreography of audits, drills, and alliances designed to prevent the return of the ousted regime. It is neither glamorous nor celebratory. It is the slow, exacting stewardship that ensures yesterday's triumph is not tomorrow's cautionary tale. The first line of defense is ritualized reconnaissance, a dawn scan performed before the mind fills with obligations. Feet planted, spine aligned, you inventory joints, breath depth, and micro-expressions in the mirror. Any shoulder rise beyond neutral, any breath stalled in the upper chest, any furrow between the brows, however faint, is flagged as a border skirmish. You mark these observations in a ledger, dated and specific, so that patterns reveal themselves across weeks, rather than slipping beneath the radar of day-to-day distraction. What gets measured is difficult to ignore. What remains unmeasured metastasizes into habit. Surveillance alone will not suffice. A garrison must drill even in peacetime, lest skill degrade into ceremonial rust. Weekly body work, myofascial release, osteopathic articulation, deep tissue massage, acts as a standing army that patrols connective tissue for insurgent adhesions, paired with breathwork calibrated to shift states, from box breathing to down, regulating size. These sessions remind the nervous system of its expanded template. On the mat or massage table, you interrogate the suspicion that comfort guarantees safety. You teach tissue that ongoing elasticity, not static ease, is the hallmark of sovereignty. Should a knot relinquish under pressure, you follow the surrender with lengthening stretches, reinvesting the liberated range of motion with purpose, rather than leaving it vacant for trauma to repossess. Allies are indispensable. Even the most vigilant ruler is subject to blindness regarding his own court. You appoint confidants, mentors, coaches, sparring partners, licensed to challenge posture, cadence, or behavioral drift. During conversation, they are empowered to signal the flinch you do not feel in real time, the pitch drop in your voice when hierarchy looms, the encroaching fatigue masked by caffeine and forced smiles. Their role is not to coddle but to calibrate, to hold a mirror polished to merciless clarity. Each exposure, though unpleasant, prevents small deviations from calcifying into structural regressions. Loyalty to growth supersedes loyalty to comfort. Friendship is measured by the willingness to call out relapse before it matures. Architecture extends the guard beyond the flesh. Your living and working environments become sentinels that nudge you toward the open stance of freedom. A low bench for deep squats replaces the cushioned throne that encourages spinal collapse. A standing desk stations the diaphragm above the pelvis, making slouching a logistical nuisance. Lighting softens glare and coaxes pupils to relax, scent anchors memory to calm. Even digital landscapes obey this logic. Notifications are silenced to spare the nervous system from jittery drip, feeds of novelty. Color palettes are chosen to discourage compulsive stimulation. Space becomes a co-conspirator, whispering cues that reinforce the liberated pattern until obedience to openness feels as automatic as the old allegiance to contraction once did. Cycles of challenge are embedded like seasonal taxes. Quarterly, you submit to a controlled ordeal, a silent retreat, a marathon row, a 48-hour fast. The ordeal functions as a stress inoculation, deliberately dipping the psyche into discomfort so that resilience remains current. Trauma thrives in surprise and novelty. By voluntarily courting hardship, you reduce its arsenal. Each ordeal is bracketed by preparation and integration. No reckless plunges, only calculated expansions that teach the body to metabolize intensity without defaulting to collapse. Over time, the baseline of what constitutes threat rises, relegating former triggers to the category of minor inconvenience. Yet guarding the realm is not an ascetic retreat from pleasure. It is a curation of pleasures that align with sovereignty. Music that widens the ribcage, meals that nourish without sedation, intimacy that honors consent-driven relaxation. All become celebratory patrols, reminding the kingdom why vigilance is worthwhile. Laughter that vibrates through loosened abdominals is evidence that the walls of defense have not morphed into prison bars. Joy, when curated as practice rather than accident, serves as the most persuasive propaganda campaign a nervous system can receive, broadcasting the message that safety and expansion are compatible states. Even diplomacy has its role. Old allies who remain ensnared in their own somatic tyrannies will test your borders with unconscious invitations to regress. You meet them without superiority, but with boundaries sharper than any sermon. Should their chaos seep into conversation, you pivot through breath and posture. Chin level, shoulders wide, modeling regulation instead of absorbing frenzy. Influence becomes a subtle export. You trade composure for collaboration, insistence for indulgence, demonstrating that the realm you guard is permeable only to energies that respect its new constitution. In time, some will defect from their own tyrannies, drawn by the visible dividends of your vigilance, while others will drift to peripheries, where their turbulence finds no anchor. Throughout this journey of reclaiming your body from the silent chains of trauma, you have witnessed the profound truth that liberation is neither swift nor simple. It is a deliberate campaign waged within the fortress of your own flesh. The invisible sovereign once held court in your muscles and breath, commanding retreat where you yearn to advance, and scripting limits where desire sought infinity. Yet by naming this ruler, by mapping its strongholds, by confronting its grip with disciplined courage, you begin to dismantle its dominion stone by stone. The alchemy of pain reveals itself not as a curse, but as the raw material of transformation, forged through intentional breath and movement into unyielding strength. Strategic awareness and relentless vigilance become your arsenal, guarding the realm of newfound freedom against relapse and complacency. In choosing to stand unflinching within discomfort, to rewrite the laws inscribed in your connective tissue, you do more than free yourself. You create a legacy of sovereignty that ripples beyond your own body, inspiring future generations to inhabit their fullest potential. This is not a tale of passive healing, but a manifesto of mastery, the conscious reclaiming of power, the forging of presence, and the unwavering commitment to live unshackled by past shadows, marching instead toward the life you have longed for.